The night it all began wasn't just any night. It was the celebration of my father's 52nd birthday, an intimate gathering in the sprawling backyard of the house where I grew up. We strung up fairy lights, and my wife, Emily, was the star of the show, flitting between guests with her effortless charm. Emily, 21, had always had a way of making an impression. Even in our small town, where everyone seemed to know everyone, she managed to be the one people couldn't stop talking about. She had that spark, the kind of energy that lit up a room and made you forget your troubles. I often wondered how someone like her ended up with someone like me, an average guy, freshly 25, still figuring out life. The night hummed along, with laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint hum of the 80s rock playlist Dad swore by. But amid the joy, there was a strange tension, a feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on. Dad, Robert, was in his element, his deep laugh cutting through the crowd. He'd always been larger than life, a man who'd built himself up from nothing to become the town's most respected contractor. He was charismatic, yes, but there was something in the way he interacted with Emily that night that gave me pause. It started innocently enough. A shared laugh, a playful nudge, a conversation that seemed a little too animated. Emily wore that crimson dress I loved, the one she'd bought for our first anniversary dinner just months ago. Dad's eyes lingered a little longer than I was comfortable with, but I brushed it off. It was his birthday, after all, and maybe I was being overly sensitive. Still, the image of them standing a little too close, their laughter echoing louder than anyone else's, lingered in my mind long after the party was over. As the last guest left, and the house grew quiet, Emily turned to me with her usual bright smile. "Your dad's so full of life," she said, kicking off her heels and plopping down onto our couch. "Yeah, he is," I replied, forcing a chuckle. But something about the way she said it didn't sit right. Over the next few days, that night played on a loop in my head. Emily and Dad laughing. The way his hand rested on her shoulder for just a moment too long. The way she seemed to light up in his presence in a way I hadn't seen in a while. I tried to push it aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something was off. A few weeks after the party, life went back to its usual rhythm, work, errands, and the mundane hum of daily life. Emily was her usual self, or so I thought. But something in me couldn't shake the unease I'd felt that night. I tried to bury it under the routine, but it kept clawing its way to the surface. It was a Wednesday evening when I stumbled upon something strange. Emily had asked me to grab a folder from the drawer in our bedroom while she prepped dinner. As I rifled through the drawer, my hand brushed against a small, folded piece of paper tucked between some old receipts. I almost left it there. Almost. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded it. The handwriting wasn't Emily's. It was neat and angular, with a confidence I immediately recognized. It was my dad's. The note was brief. "Emily, I meant what I said. Let's not let this linger too long. Call me." My stomach dropped. The words felt like a slap, each one ringing in my ears. I read it again, and then again, as if some new meaning might reveal itself. But the message was clear. What had Dad meant? What exactly was he asking her to call about? I sat down heavily on the bed, the note still in my hand, my mind racing. 1,000 explanations whirled through my head, each one more troubling than the last. Was it business-related? Something about the party? But why wouldn't he just talk to me if it was something important? Emily's voice pulled me back to reality. "Hey, dinner's ready!" she called from the kitchen, her tone light and cheerful. I stuffed the note back where I'd found it, my heart pounding. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could confront her about, not yet. I needed more. As I walked to the kitchen, I plastered on a smile, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I felt like a ticking time bomb. At dinner, Emily chatted away about her day, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I watched her closely, looking for any signs, any cracks in her sunny demeanor. But she was perfect, too perfect. As the evening wore on, I felt the pressure building, like a dam about to break. I wanted to ask her about the note, to demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of the answer. Maybe it was the hope that I was wrong. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. To understand why the note hit me so hard, you need to know a bit more about my dad, Robert. He's the kind of man people admire from a distance, charismatic, successful, and always the life of the party. But up close? Well, let's just say he's complicated. Dad's always been a charmer. Even when I was a kid, I remember watching him effortlessly work a room, whether it was a family barbecue or a business meeting. People gravitated toward him. Women especially. Mom used to joke about his wandering eyes, but I knew there was truth beneath her laughter. Their marriage ended when I was 10, after she finally had enough of his late nights, unexplained trips, and whispered phone calls. Since then, he'd dated a string of women, most of them younger, most of them temporary. He had a type, ambitious, pretty, and easily dazzled by his confidence. He wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't a saint either. I grew up loving and resenting him in equal measure. He provided for me, made sure I had every opportunity, but he was also emotionally distant, as if parenting was just another deal he had to close. So when I saw that note, my mind couldn't help but connect the dots. Dad had always been good at getting what he wanted. And Emily? Emily was complicated too. When we met 2 years ago, I was immediately drawn to her. She was sharp, witty, and stunningly beautiful in a way that made people do double takes. But what really got me was her fire. She had this way of lighting up every room she walked into, demanding attention without even trying. She came from a modest background and had worked hard to climb the social ladder. She had big dreams of starting her own boutique business someday, but for now, she worked as an assistant for a high-end interior designer in town. She was ambitious, sometimes to a fault. Emily had a bold streak that I loved and feared in equal measure. She was fiercely independent, quick to call out unfairness, and unapologetically herself. But she also had a knack for manipulating situations to her advantage. It wasn't malicious, most of the time, anyway. She just knew how to read people and use that to steer things her way. It was one of the things that first attracted me to her, but it also gave me pause. I'd seen her talk her way out of parking tickets, convince friends to cover for her at work, and even charm her way into a promotion she wasn't entirely qualified for. I didn't doubt her love for me, or at least, I hadn't until recently. But there were moments when I wondered if she sometimes saw our marriage as another rung on the ladder. And now, with Dad in the picture, I couldn't ignore the thought that she might see him as more than just my father. The image of Dad and Emily laughing together at his birthday party haunted me. Knowing Dad's history with women and Emily's ambitious streak, I started piecing together the subtle moments I'd overlooked. The way Dad had complimented her outfit, saying she looked far too glamorous for our little gathering. The shared joke that had them both doubling over with laughter while I stood awkwardly to the side. How Emily had gone out of her way to make him a special whiskey cocktail, researching the exact way he liked it served. At the time, I'd chalked it up to her trying to make a good impression. After all, she was my wife, and he was my dad. Of course, she'd want him to like her. But now, those moments didn't feel so innocent. As I replayed these memories in my head, a chill ran down my spine. Dad was a womanizer, no doubt about it. And Emily was clever enough to use her charm to get what she wanted. But what was it they wanted from each other? The pressure was building, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear: I couldn't ignore this any longer. The unease I felt after finding the note didn't fade, it grew. I started to notice things I might have otherwise dismissed. Emily was spending more time out of the house, claiming it was work-related. My dad, who normally called or visited sporadically, was suddenly reaching out more often, asking casual questions about how Emily was doing or when we next stopped by. It wasn't enough to confront either of them, but it was enough to keep me on edge. Then came the phone call. It was late one Friday evening, and Emily had gone to bed early, saying she had a headache. I was in the living room, flipping through channels and trying to distract myself from my spiraling thoughts, when her phone, left on the coffee table, buzzed. I glanced at the screen, intending to ignore it, but the name flashing across stopped me cold. Robert. It was my dad. My heart started racing as the phone buzzed again, then again. 3 missed calls in rapid succession. What could be so urgent that my dad was calling my wife at this hour? I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the green answer button. My brain was screaming at me to pick up, but something stopped me. Instead, I let it go to voicemail, setting the phone back down as though it might burn me. Seconds later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. I need to talk to you. Call me as soon as you can. My stomach churned. This wasn't just casual. There was something going on, something that didn't sit right. For a moment, I just stared at the phone, my mind racing. Should I wake Emily up and demand an explanation? Should I call Dad myself and ask him why he was so desperate to reach her? Instead, I did something I'm not proud of. I unlocked her phone. Emily and I had always been open about our devices. We knew each other's passcodes, and I told myself this wasn't snooping. This was about protecting our marriage, protecting my sanity. At least, that's how I justified it. I opened her messages and found a thread between her and Dad. My hands were trembling as I scrolled up, searching for anything that might explain the call. The messages weren't outright damning, but they were strange. I've been thinking about our conversation. Let's not let this get out of hand. I know. I'll handle it. Don't worry. It's not just about you. We both have to be careful. What the hell were they talking about? Handle what? Be careful about what? My mind leaped to a dozen conclusions, none of them good. And yet none of the messages outright confirmed my worst fears. It was enough to make me question everything but not enough to give me clarity. The most recent message from Dad was from earlier that day. Dad, if you're not sure, just let me know. I can fix it. Fix what? The sound of Emily shifting in bed snapped me back to reality. I quickly locked her phone and set it back on the table, my heart pounding in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake next to Emily, the weight of the messages pressing down on me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces weren't fitting together in any innocent way. What conversation had they had? Why was Dad so insistent on secrecy? And why was Emily going along with it? Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, but I couldn't. Not without more. Not without the truth. Instead, I decided to do what I'd never thought I'd have to do. I was going to watch them. The next morning, as the sunlight poured through the blinds, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and watching Emily bustle around the house. She was humming to herself, her hair tied up in that messy bun I used to think was the cutest thing in the world. But now, every little thing she did felt like a riddle I couldn't solve. I'd decided, if I wanted answers, I needed to create a moment where they couldn't hide anything. A way to force whatever was going on into the light. That's when the idea hit me, a dinner party. It wasn't unusual for us to host dinners. Emily loved entertaining, and Dad was always up for a free meal and a chance to hold court with his stories. I'd make it seem casual, spontaneous even, but my real plan was to watch them interact closely, see if I could catch any cracks in their carefully constructed masks. Hey, I said, leaning back in my chair as Emily breezed past me. What do you think about having Dad over for dinner this weekend? It's been a while since we've all hung out. She stopped mid-step, her back to me. For a moment I thought she might say no, but then she turned around with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sure. That sounds nice. Nice. That single word was laced with something I couldn't place. Relief? Hesitation? Guilt? I called Dad that afternoon, keeping my voice as light and casual as I could manage. Hey, Dad. Emily and I were thinking about having you over for dinner Saturday night. Just the 3 of us. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The 3 of us, huh? He said, his tone unreadable. Yeah. Thought it'd be nice to catch up. I'll even make your favorite, steak, medium rare. He chuckled, but there was an edge to it. How can I say no to that? As I hung up, I felt the first flicker of doubt in my plan. What was I hoping to find? Did I really want to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be? By the time Saturday rolled around, I had everything prepared. The table was set, the wine was chilling, and the house was spotless. Emily had gone all out, dressing in a sleek black dress and putting on the necklace I'd bought her for our last anniversary. "You look amazing," I said, and for a moment I meant it. But then I remembered why we were doing this, and the knot in my stomach tightened. When Dad arrived, he was his usual self, smiling, confident, larger than life. He hugged Emily a little longer than necessary, complimented her on the food, and launched into a story about one of his recent business deals. At first, everything seemed normal. Too normal. But as the evening went on, I started to notice the little things. The way Emily seemed to anticipate Dad's jokes, laughing a second too early. The way his eyes lingered on her when he thought I wasn't looking. The way their conversation felt like it was happening on two levels, one I could hear and another I couldn't. And then, halfway through the meal, I dropped the bomb. "So, Dad," I said, setting my fork down, "what's this big secret you've been talking to Emily about?" The room went still. Emily froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips, while Dad leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "Secret?" he asked, his tone light. "Yeah," I said, leaning forward. "The one you mentioned in that note. You know, the one where you told Emily you'd fix it." Emily's face went pale, and Dad's confident facade slipped, just for a moment. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Dad said, his voice measured. "Is there?" I asked, my eyes darting between the two of them. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like I'm the one being left out of something." The tension in the room was suffocating. Emily opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. Dad shifted in his seat, reaching for his glass of water. I didn't say another word. I just let the silence hang, waiting for one of them to break it. Finally, Emily stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. "I need a minute." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me and Dad alone at the table. "So," I said, locking eyes with him, "you gonna tell me what's going on, or do I have to find out the hard way?" Dad took a slow sip of his water, setting the glass down with an exaggerated calmness that only made my blood boil. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Son," he began, his tone almost patronizing, "I think you're reading too much into this." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. "Am I? Because that note didn't exactly scream casual conversation, Dad." He shook his head, chuckling softly, like I was a child accusing him of stealing a cookie. "That note wasn't anything serious. Emily and I were just talking about you, actually." "Me?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Yeah," he said, leaning forward now, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "She's been worried about you, about how hard you've been working lately. She wanted advice on how to get you to slow down. You know, make sure you're not burning yourself out." My heart twisted at the plausibility of his words. It wasn't like Emily to talk about my work habits behind my back, but it wasn't impossible either. "Then why the secrecy?" I pressed. He shrugged, a carefree gesture that only frustrated me more. "She didn't want you to feel embarrassed. You know how stubborn you can be about work." The word stung because he wasn't entirely wrong. I'd been throwing myself into longer hours lately, trying to save up for a new car we'd been planning to buy. Emily had mentioned my work habits a few times, saying I needed to find a better balance. Before I could respond, Emily returned from the kitchen, her face composed but her eyes glistening like she'd been crying. She sat down and avoided looking directly at me. "I was going to tell you," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to make it sound genuine. "I didn't want to go behind your back, but I was worried, and your dad seemed like the right person to talk to." Her performance was Oscar-worthy. She even reached for my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "I wasn't trying to keep anything from you, I swear." I just wanted to help. The knot in my stomach tightened as I glanced between the two of them. The story made sense, too much sense. But something still felt off. If that's the case, I said slowly, pulling my hand away from hers, why didn't you just talk to me directly? I tried, she said, her voice breaking. But every time I brought it up, you'd brush it off or change the subject. I thought maybe if I got some advice from someone you respect, it would help. Dad nodded in agreement, his expression solemn. She came to me as a last resort. You know how much she cares about you. I wanted to believe them, but the pit in my stomach told me there was more to this than they were letting on. Still, without concrete proof, what could I do? Dinner continued in strained silence. Emily tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, asking Dad about his latest projects and laughing a little too hard at his jokes. Dad played along, his charm on full display, but I wasn't fooled. As the night went on, I found myself questioning everything. Was I overthinking this? Was my imagination running wild because of a stupid note? Or were they playing me, weaving a web of lies to keep their secrets hidden? By the time Dad left, I was exhausted, emotionally and mentally. Emily kissed me on the cheek and whispered, I hope you're not mad at me, before heading to bed. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty wine glasses on the table. The story they told me felt plausible, but it didn't sit right. If they were lying, they were good at it. Too good. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan in the walls. Emily had gone to bed hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to join her. My mind was a whirlwind of doubt and frustration, replaying the events of the dinner over and over. Their story had been perfect. Too perfect. Unable to sit still, I got up and started pacing the living room, my thoughts spinning like a carousel I couldn't step off of. That's when I noticed something, Emily's purse. It was sitting on the couch, half-zipped, with a folded piece of paper sticking out. My pulse quickened. Emily never left her purse lying around like that, especially not with personal items visible. I hesitated. I knew this wasn't right, but the nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't let me walk away. I reached for the paper, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. It was a receipt. My stomach dropped as I scanned the details. It was from a luxury hotel in the city, the Bellevue, a place I knew all too well for its sky-high prices and impeccable reputation. The date on the receipt? Just 3 days ago. The charges weren't small either. Dinner for two, $250. Room service, $180. Overnight stay in the Ambassador Suite, $800. My throat went dry. Emily hadn't mentioned going to the city, let alone staying at a hotel. And the dinner for two? It didn't take a genius to figure out she wasn't dining alone. My first instinct was anger. But then, as I stared at the receipt, something else caught my eye. The signature at the bottom wasn't Emily's. It was my dad's. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the couch, clutching the receipt like it was a live wire. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head, each more unsettling than the last. Why would Dad have a receipt from a hotel in the city? Why was it in Emily's purse? And what the hell had they been doing there? I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to piece together the impossible puzzle, when a sharp knock at the door jolted me out of my thoughts. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? I got up, my heart pounding, and opened the door to find a man standing there, a stranger, dressed in a crisp suit, his expression unreadable. Mr. Thompson? He asked, his voice low and formal. Yes? I replied, my voice shaky. He handed me an envelope. This is for you. Please read it carefully. Before I could ask any questions, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stared at the envelope, my name scrawled on it in neat handwriting. Slowly, I opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was simple, but it felt like a dagger to the chest. Mr. Thompson, there are things you don't know. I suggest you start looking closer. Ask your father about room 712. Time is running out. Room 712. I staggered back into the house, the letter slipping from my fingers. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. Someone knew. Someone was watching. I didn't know who had sent the letter or why, but one thing was clear: the lies went deeper than I'd thought. The letter sat on the coffee table, staring back at me like a challenge. My hands were clammy, and my heart wouldn't slow down. Room 712. What was it about that room, and how was it connected to the mess unraveling around me? Sleep was impossible, so I spent the rest of the night pacing the living room. By sunrise I made up my mind: I needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. By noon, I was standing in the gleaming marble lobby of the Bellevue Hotel. The place reeked of wealth, with its polished chandeliers and uniformed staff who moved like clockwork. My jeans and hoodie made me stick out like a sore thumb, but I didn't care. The concierge, a sharp-looking woman with a practiced smile, raised an eyebrow as I approached. "Welcome to the Bellevue. How can I assist you today?" I hesitated for a split second, then decided to lean into the charm my dad always seemed to wield so effortlessly. "Hi, I think I may have left something in room 712 a few days ago. Is there any chance I could check?" Her expression faltered just slightly before she recovered. "Room 712? I'm sorry, sir, but that room isn't currently occupied." I nodded, keeping my voice casual. "That's fine. I just need a quick look. You can send someone with me if it's against policy." Her smile became tighter, and she glanced at her screen. "Are you sure about the room number? Because we don't have a room 712. The words hit me like a punch. "What do you mean you don't have a room 712? I saw it on a receipt." She tilted her head, clearly puzzled now. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. Our room's on the 7th floor and at 710. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell was going on? I left the hotel feeling more confused than ever. Someone had sent me that letter, someone who wanted me to believe there was a room 712. And if the hotel staff wasn't lying, then what was the purpose of the message? That evening, I decided to confront the only person who might have answers: Dad. He hosted a weekly poker night with a group of old friends, and tonight, I knew exactly where to find him: his deck, overlooking the lake behind his house. When I arrived, the game was in full swing. Cigars, whiskey glasses, and loud laughter filled the air. Dad spotted me immediately, his jovial expression faltering just for a second before he plastered on his usual grin. "Son! What brings you by?" I forced a smile. "Needed to talk to you about something." He raised an eyebrow, then gestured to his friends. "You guys mind giving us a minute?" As they cleared out, Dad leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of whiskey. "What's on your mind?" I didn't waste time. "The Bellevue Hotel. Room 712. Ring any bells?" His hand froze mid-swirl, the amber liquid sloshing slightly in the glass. His mask slipped for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice steady, but his grip on the glass tightened. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, stepping closer. "The receipt. The note. The lies. Stop playing games with me, Dad. What's going on?" He leaned forward, setting his glass down with a thud. "Listen to me, and listen carefully," he said, his voice low and firm. "You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Drop it." My blood ran cold. "What does that mean? What aren't you telling me?" "I'm trying to protect you," he said, his tone softening just slightly. "Sometimes it's better not to know everything." "No," I snapped. "You don't get to decide what I should or shouldn't know. Tell me the truth." For a moment I thought he might crack. But then he shook his head, standing up and walking past me toward the house. "Let it go," he said without turning around. "For your own good." As I drove home, his words echoed in my head. Let it go. But I couldn't. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than I'd realized. And if Dad thought he could scare me off, he had another thing coming. Back at home, Emily was already asleep, her face serene and peaceful. I stared at her for a long moment, wondering how much of the truth was hidden behind that perfect exterior. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to stop until I found out. I didn't sleep that night. Dad's cryptic warning and the strange message about room 712 swirled in my mind, looping endlessly like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. By morning, I'd made a decision: I needed help. I wasn't about to involve Emily, and Dad had made it clear he wasn't going to talk. But someone else knew something, whoever sent that letter. I'd almost dismissed the envelope when it caught my eye again. There was a faint indentation on the back, like it had been pressed into something solid. On a hunch, I held it under the kitchen light, tilting it to catch the faint ridges. A return address? It wasn't complete, just a series of numbers and a street name, 1620 Oak Ridge Avenue. It wasn't far, a 20-minute drive from our house. My gut told me it was a trap, but my curiosity was louder than my fear. I grabbed my keys and headed out, telling myself I was ready for whatever waited for me. Oak Ridge Avenue wasn't what I expected. It was an industrial part of town, all warehouses and empty lots. Number 1620 was no different, a rundown building with faded paint and a chain-link fence that looked like it had seen better days. I parked a block away and walked toward it, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back. But I pushed forward, my eyes scanning for any movement. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a creak that echoed in the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and something metallic. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. Nothing. I stepped further in, the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. The space was eerily empty, just rows of broken furniture and scattered debris. But as I moved deeper into the building, I noticed something odd: a single chair, perfectly intact, sitting in the middle of the room. On it was another envelope. This one was larger than the first, sealed with a wax stamp. My name was scrawled across it, the handwriting identical to the previous letter. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a photo. The picture was grainy, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the figures in it. Emily and my dad, sitting together in what looked like a hotel lounge. They weren't touching, but their body language was unmistakable, leaning in close, speaking in hushed tones. Beneath the photo was a single sentence, typed in bold letters. "They aren't telling you everything. Meet me tomorrow at 10 p.m. in the park by the lake. Come alone." I stumbled out of the building, clutching the photo like it was a lifeline. My mind was a storm of emotions, rage, confusion, and fear, all battling for dominance. The photo wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it confirmed one thing: there was more going on that Emily or Dad wanted me to know. By the time I got home, it was late. Emily was curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her expression shifting to concern. "Hey," she said softly. "You've been out all day. Everything okay?" I hesitated, the photo burning a hole in my pocket. I wanted to pull it out, to confront her, but something stopped me. Whoever sent the letter wanted me to meet them tomorrow. If I confronted Emily now, I might lose my chance to get real answers. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some air." She didn't press further, but as I watched her go back to her phone, I couldn't help but wonder, was she texting him? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The photo, the letter, the strange location, everything about this situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. But I'd made up my mind. Tomorrow, I'd go to the park. I'd meet whoever was behind this and find out what they knew. Because one thing was clear: the truth was out there, and I was going to uncover it, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew. The next day dragged like an eternity. Emily asked me a few times if something was wrong, but I just brushed her off, saying I was tired. She bought it, or at least pretended to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me more closely than usual. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, the house was silent. Emily had gone to bed, and I slipped out as quietly as I could, the photo and letter tucked into my jacket pocket. The park by the lake was a place I knew well. It was where my dad used to take me fishing when I was a kid, where I'd proposed to Emily, where I'd imagined bringing our future kids someday. But tonight, it felt foreign and eerie, like the ghost of a life I didn't recognize anymore haunted its paths. The lake reflected the crescent moon, its surface shimmering in the cold night air. I stood near the bench by the water, my breath visible in the chill, waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I started to wonder if this was some kind of sick joke. But just as I was about to leave, I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path behind me. I turned to see a man step out of the shadows, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He was tall, wearing a black jacket and gloves, his movements calculated and calm. "You came," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Who are you?" I demanded, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another photo, handing it to me. My stomach churned as I looked at it. This one was worse. It was a photo of Emily and Dad, inside what I now recognized as the Bellevue's ambassador suite. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand on Dad's shoulder, their faces close. Not kissing, but close enough to make me sick. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Someone who knows the truth," he said simply. "And someone who thinks you deserve to know it too." I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "What truth? Why don't you just say it?" "Because saying it isn't enough," he replied. "You need to see it for yourself." He reached into his pocket again and handed me a small USB drive. "What's this?" I asked, glaring at him. "Proof," he said. "Videos, photos, messages. Everything you need to understand what's been happening behind your back. Why should I trust you?" "You don't have to," he said, turning to leave. "But if you want answers, you'll look at what's on that drive." I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the USB drive in my hand. Part of me wanted to throw it into the lake, to walk away and pretend none of this was happening. But the other part, the part that had been tortured by doubt for weeks, needed to know. When I got home, the house was quiet. Emily was asleep, her steady breathing the only sound. I locked myself in the office, plugged the drive into my laptop, and waited as the files loaded. There were dozens of folders, each labeled with dates that stretched back months. The first video made my blood run cold. It was surveillance footage from the Bellevue lobby. Emily and Dad, walking side by side, laughing. They got into the elevator together, and the timestamp on the footage matched the date on the receipt. The second file was worse. It was a recording from the hallway outside the ambassador suite. Emily opened the door, glanced down the hall, then stepped inside. Moments later, Dad followed, closing the door behind him. My hands were shaking as I opened the third file. It was a text thread between Dad and Emily, screenshots taken from what looked like Dad's phone. "You sure he doesn't suspect anything? He's clueless. Trust me, we're fine." "Good. Just remember, this only works if we keep it quiet. No mistakes." The files kept coming, each one more damning than the last. Photos of them together in restaurants, videos of them in parking lots, more messages discussing plans I couldn't fully piece together. But the final file was what broke me. It was a voicemail from Emily to Dad. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks again for today. I know this hasn't been easy, but we're almost there. Just a little longer, and he'll be out of the picture." I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving. The evidence was undeniable. Whatever their plans were, they involved me, and they weren't good. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't confused anymore. I was angry. I sat in the dim light of the office, staring at the laptop as though it might spring to life and explain everything. But the truth was there, plain as day. Emily and Dad weren't just sneaking around, they were plotting something. Something that went beyond betrayal. The words from Emily's voicemail echoed in my head. "Just a little longer, and he'll be out of the picture." Out of the picture. I clenched my fists, my breathing shallow. The rage burned in my chest, but I couldn't let it take over. Not yet. If I blew up now, they'd close ranks, spin lies, and leave me with nothing but more questions. I needed to play this smart. I powered off the laptop, tucked the USB drive into the hidden compartment of my desk, and left the office. The next morning, Emily was already up, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee. She smiled when she saw me, her face a perfect mask of warmth and familiarity. "Morning," she said brightly. I forced a smile, the effort almost painful. "Morning." She tilted her head, her eyes scanning my face. "You okay? You seem off." "Didn't sleep well," I said, shrugging as casually as I could manage. She nodded, reaching out to touch my arm. The gesture, once comforting, now felt like a lie. "You've been working so hard lately," she said softly. "Maybe you should take a day off. We could spend some time together, just the two of us." The audacity of her suggestion almost made me laugh. Instead, I nodded. "Yeah, maybe." Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it quickly before flipping it face down. My stomach churned at the sight. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just work," she replied without missing a beat. "Tracy needs help with a client." Tracy. The convenient scapegoat. After Emily left for work, I sat down to figure out my next move. I couldn't confront them outright, not yet. I needed to know what their endgame was, what they were planning to gain by keeping me in the dark. My first call was to an old friend, Kevin. He worked in IT security and owed me a favor from years ago when I'd helped him out of a tight spot. "Kevin," I said when he picked up, "I need your help with something sensitive." "Sensitive how?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Let's just say it's personal. I need to know if you can dig into some phone records for me." There was a pause, then a sigh. "You know I don't usually do this kind of thing." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important," I said. "Please." Another pause. "Fine. Send me the numbers, and I'll see what I can do." I rattled off Emily's and Dad's phone numbers, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. By late afternoon, Kevin called me back. "You're not gonna like this," he said, his voice grim. "Tell me. Your wife's been in regular contact with your dad. Almost daily. Calls, texts, even some video chats. And get this, they've been making a lot of calls to a third number." "What number?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "It's listed to someone named Charles Moore." "The name ring a bell?" I froze. Charles Moore was a lawyer, a high-powered divorce attorney who specialized in cases where one spouse was trying to seize significant assets. "They're working with a lawyer?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like it," Kevin said. "And not just any lawyer. This guy's got a reputation for playing dirty." The pieces started falling into place. The secret meetings, the messages, the hotel stays. They weren't just sneaking around, they were setting me up. When Emily came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. She kissed me on the cheek, her smile as radiant as ever. "How was your day?" she asked, sitting beside me. "Uneventful," I lied, my face a mask of indifference. I couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside me. Not yet. Because now I knew what they were planning. They weren't just betraying me, they were planning to destroy me. And I wasn't about to let them. I spent the next few days living in a surreal fog, balancing the knowledge of their betrayal with the need to keep my cool. Emily carried on as though nothing was wrong, and Dad's texts to me were as casual as ever. Their ability to maintain the facade was almost impressive, almost. But the more I thought about it, the more their plan began to make sense. The frequent calls to Charles Moore weren't a coincidence. If they were working with him, it meant one thing: they were setting me up for a divorce, and not just any divorce. They were aiming to take everything. The house, the savings, my reputation. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was war. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. That evening, I called my brother Matt. Unlike Dad, Matt had always been someone I could trust. He was a straight shooter, someone who didn't mince words or tolerate lies. Matt, I said as soon as he picked up, I need you to hear me out before you say anything. Okay, he said, his voice cautious. What's going on? I told him everything, the notes, the photos, the files on the USB drive, and the connection to Charles Moore. By the time I finished, Matt was silent. Holy crap, he finally said. I knew Dad could be a piece of work, but this? Are you sure? I'm sure, I said. I've seen the evidence myself. What's your plan? I don't have one yet, I admitted. But I need someone in my corner, and I need to know I'm not crazy. You're not crazy, he said firmly. And whatever you need, I'm here. Just tell me what to do. Hearing those words felt like a lifeline. For the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, Emily was unusually distant. She avoided eye contact and spent more time than usual on her phone. It was subtle, but I could sense a shift. Everything okay? I asked over breakfast, trying to sound casual. Yeah, she said quickly, not looking up from her coffee. Why wouldn't it be? I shrugged, watching her closely. You just seem distracted. I'm fine, she said, her voice clipped. Something was happening. I could feel it. That afternoon, I decided to pay Charles Moore a visit. I knew it was risky, but I needed to see him for myself. I needed to confirm that Emily and Dad were working with him. The office was exactly what I expected, sleek, modern, and designed to intimidate. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile, greeted me as I walked in. Do you have an appointment? She asked. No, I said, my voice steady. But I need to speak to Mr. Moore. It's urgent. She hesitated, then nodded. One moment, please. A few minutes later, I was escorted into a spacious office. Charles Moore was every bit the shark I'd imagined, tall, confident, and exuding an air of authority. Mr. Thompson, he said, motioning for me to sit. What can I do for you? I think you already know, I said, my voice cold. I know my wife and my father have been in contact with you. His expression didn't falter. I'm afraid I can't confirm or deny that. Cut the crap, I snapped. I know they've been planning something, and I know you're involved. So tell me, what's their endgame? He leaned back in his chair, studying me. Mr. Thompson, as much as I'd love to help, attorney-client privilege prevents me from discussing any details. I will say, however, that you seem like a man who's caught in a difficult situation. My advice? Get your own lawyer. The smugness in his tone was like a slap to the face. I already have one, I lied, standing up. And if you think you can help them screw me over, you're in for a fight. I turned and walked out, my blood boiling. By the time I got home, I'd made up my mind. Emily and Dad thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know I was onto them. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them ruin me. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about winning. Emily was already home when I got back, sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. Her expression was calm, almost too calm, as she typed away. She glanced up when I walked in, giving me a tight smile. Hey, how was your day? She asked, her voice light. Fine, I replied, forcing the words out. I sat down across from her, my mind racing with everything I'd learned. She didn't know I'd been to Moore's office, and I wasn't about to let on. Not yet. But her composure, her ability to act like everything was normal, it made my skin crawl. Anything new with you? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Nope, same old, she said, not missing a beat. Her phone buzzed on the table, and I couldn't help but glance at it. The screen lit up with a message. Are we still on for tomorrow? Are. My heart lurched, but I didn't let my expression change. Who's are? I asked, gesturing to her phone. She looked down, her face betraying the slightest flicker of unease before she quickly masked it. Oh, just Rachel from work. We're meeting up for coffee tomorrow. I nodded, pretending to believe her. Sounds nice. But inside, my blood was boiling. I wasn't Rachel, it was Robert. That night, while Emily was in the shower, I made my move. Her phone was on the nightstand, and I knew she used the same passcode for everything. With shaking hands, I unlocked it and opened her messages. Sure enough, the message from Dad was there. Dad, we need to go over the paperwork again before tomorrow. Call me later. Emily, can't talk tonight. He's home. Let's meet early. Paperwork. Tomorrow. They were planning something big, and I was running out of time. I quickly forwarded the messages to my own phone and locked hers again, placing it back exactly where it had been. As I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep beside her, my mind raced. Whatever they were planning was happening tomorrow, and I had to be ready. The next morning I called Matt. They're meeting tomorrow, I said, pacing the living room as I spoke. I saw the messages. Something about paperwork. Matt cursed under his breath. You think it's the divorce stuff? Has to be, I said. But I need proof. Something I can use against them before they blindside me. Do you know where they're meeting? He asked. No, I admitted, frustrated. But it has to be somewhere private. They wouldn't risk doing this in public. Matt was quiet for a moment, then said, What if I followed Dad? He's predictable, always sticking to a routine. I could tail him and see where he goes. The idea sent a rush of relief through me. Are you sure? Yeah, he said firmly. If he's screwing you over, I want to see it for myself. I'll call you as soon as I know where they are. True to his word, Matt called me later that afternoon. They're at Dad's cabin, he said, his voice tense. I'm parked down the road. I saw Emily's car pull in about 10 minutes ago. The cabin. It made sense. Dad's lakefront retreat was secluded, perfect for whatever underhanded deal they were finalizing. I'm on my way, I said, grabbing my keys. Wait, Matt said quickly. You need a plan. If you just barge in, they'll lie their way out of it again. He was right. But I didn't have time to come up with anything elaborate. I'll figure it out, I said. Just stay there and keep an eye on things until I get there. The drive to Dad's cabin was a blur of rage and disbelief. Matt had stayed parked a safe distance away, giving me updates as I closed the gap. They'd been inside for about 40 minutes now. He whispered over the phone. Your wife's car is right next to his. No one else has shown up. Looks quiet. Quiet wasn't the word I would have used. The storm in my chest had reached a boiling point, and the thought of whatever they were doing in there pushed me past the edge of reason. As I pulled into the dirt road leading to the cabin, I turned off my headlights and parked a few yards back, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires sounding too loud in the suffocating silence of the woods. I stepped out and crept toward the cabin, the soft glow of lamplight spilling through the windows. My heart pounded as I reached the porch, peering inside through the edge of the curtain. What I saw froze me in place. Emily was there, straddling Dad on the worn leather couch, her arms draped around his neck. Her lips were pressed to his, her crimson dress hitched up high enough to leave no doubt about what was happening. Dad's hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, his movements as unapologetically confident as ever. For a moment, the world went silent. My vision tunneled, every ounce of air sucked out of my lungs. I stumbled back, the wooden railing catching me as I gasped for breath. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a complete annihilation of everything I thought I knew. The shock lasted only seconds before it morphed into fury. My fist slammed against the door as I kicked it open, the sound of wood splintering echoing through the cabin. They froze like deer caught in headlights, their faces morphing from pleasure to pure terror in an instant. Emily scrambled off Dad, clutching at the hem of her dress, her cheeks flushed with guilt and panic. It's not what it looks like, she stammered, her voice shaking. Oh, really? I spat, stepping into the room. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear. Dad, always the master manipulator, leaned back with a calmness that made my blood boil. Son, listen. Don't you dare call me that. I roared, pointing a shaking finger at him. You think you can just do this? With my wife? Emily burst into tears, her voice cracking as she tried to explain. It was a mistake. I didn't mean. Shut up. I snapped, cutting her off. You didn't mean for me to find out, is that it? How long has this been going on? Weeks? Months? The silence that followed was damning. Answer me, I demanded, my voice breaking. Emily sobbed, burying her face in her hands, while Dad crossed his arms, his face a mask of indifference. You have no idea what's really going on, Dad said coolly, his tone dripping with condescension. You think this is just about her? About us? Then enlighten me! I yelled, my fists clenched. Before he could answer, the smell of smoke reached my nose, faint at first but growing stronger. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw it, a pan on the stove, flames licking up the cabinets. Fire! I shouted, instinct kicking in as I grabbed a nearby towel and ran toward the stove. But the flames were faster than me, climbing the walls and spreading to the curtains. Emily screamed, and Dad jumped up, grabbing a fire extinguisher from under the sink. Get out! I yelled, choking on the thickening smoke. Emily hesitated, her eyes wide with terror. What about you? Go! I barked, grabbing a pot of water and tossing it onto the growing blaze. She stumbled out of the cabin, coughing, as Dad and I worked to contain the fire. But the smoke was too thick, and the flames were spreading too fast. Leave it! Dad shouted, pulling me back. It's done! We stumbled out onto the porch, coughing and gasping for air as the flames roared behind us. The cabin was a lost cause, the fire consuming it with terrifying speed. As the fire raged, Emily stood a few feet away, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the flickering orange light. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. You burned it all, I said bitterly, my voice hoarse from the smoke. Every last shred of trust, every piece of the life we built together. It's gone. Please, she whispered, stepping toward me. I can explain. There's nothing to explain, I said, cutting her off. I saw everything. Dad stood silently, his jaw tight as he watched the flames. For once, the smugness was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. But it was too late for that. I turned to walk away, the heat of the fire at my back, and didn't look back. The acrid smell of smoke clung to my clothes, a physical reminder of the chaos I'd left behind. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and my thoughts were a tangled mess of rage, betrayal, and exhaustion. Emily hadn't said a word as I left. Dad hadn't tried to stop me. The image of the flames consuming the cabin felt symbolic, a final, fiery end to any illusion that my life was normal. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. I sat there for a long time, staring at the front door. This place, which once felt like home, now felt hollow. Everything I thought I'd built was a lie. The next morning, Emily's car wasn't in the driveway. She hadn't come home, and part of me was relieved. The thought of facing her now, of hearing more excuses and lies, was too much. Instead, I called Matt. They're both alive, if that's what you're wondering, he said when he answered, his tone grim. Dad's staying at a hotel in town. Emily's car is still at the cabin, but she's not there. Good, I muttered. What's your move? He asked. I paused, the weight of his question settling heavily on me. I'm not sure. But I can't let them walk away from this unscathed. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was from a lawyer, a friend of Matt's that he'd connected me with months ago during a property deal. I heard you might need some help, the lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Claire, said when I picked up. Help doesn't even begin to cover it, I replied, giving her a brief rundown of what had happened. She didn't flinch. Send me everything. Texts, photos, videos. If they're trying to set you up, we'll make sure the courts see the truth before they do. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. That evening, Emily came home. She looked like a shadow of herself, her makeup smudged, her eyes puffy from crying. She stepped inside hesitantly, clutching her purse like it was a shield. We need to talk, she said softly. I crossed my arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. You think? She flinched but pressed on. I'm sorry for what happened. Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. I don't want to hear excuses, Emily. I don't care why you did it, or what you thought you were gaining. The only thing I want to know is why you thought you could get away with it. Tears streamed down her face. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Robert, your dad, he promised me we could. I don't know, start over. He said you'd never understand what I wanted, what I needed. And what is that, Emily? I asked, my voice ice cold. My money? My house? Or was it just him? Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. Next week was a blur of legal meetings and preparations. Claire worked fast, filing motions to protect my assets and digging into the extent of Dad and Emily's plot. Meanwhile, Matt kept me updated on Dad. Apparently, he'd gone quiet, his usual bravado replaced with uncharacteristic silence. He knew I wasn't backing down this time. On Friday, I handed Emily divorce papers. I want you out by the end of the day, I said as she stared at the documents, her hands trembling. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of desperation and resignation. You don't mean that. We can fix this. There's nothing to fix, I replied. You burned it all down, literally and figuratively. Now it's over. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the betrayal began to lift. I sold the house, wanting nothing to do with the place that held so many broken memories. Emily moved out of state, while Dad's reputation in town took a hit he couldn't recover from. For a man who prided himself on control, losing everything he'd worked for was a fitting punishment. And me? I moved into a small, quiet place by the lake, not Dad's lake, but one far from the ghosts of my past. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch, watching the water ripple under the moonlight, and wonder if I could have seen it coming. If I could have stopped it. But I realized something important. Their betrayal didn't define me. It revealed them. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that people can surprise you in the worst ways. But they can also surprise you in the best. My brother, Claire, even my own resilience, these were the things that kept me standing when my world fell apart. And now, as I rebuild my life, I carry those lessons with me. Betrayal may leave scars, but scars don't have to define who you are.